Welcome back to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I formerly managed all things communications here at Northwest River Partners, but more on that later. Firstly, let's talk about 2024, because it has been an incredible year for this here podcast. Looking back on our catalog of episodes, we did exactly what we set out to do, and we told hours worth of untold hydropower stories, covering a wide variety of topics, and hosting guests from across the Northwest, the country, and even one internationally. Plus, we recorded an episode on location at the USSD annual conference, and we launched the educational miniseries Hydro 101. Overall, it's a body of work that I'm incredibly proud of, and I'm also incredibly thankful for all of the time and work others have put into making each episode truly special. I'm also incredibly thankful for all of you, because without you listening and supporting this podcast, we wouldn't be here. I hope you all had a chance to listen in and enjoy everything we've put together over the past year. I also want to say, in tradition with DAM, we are taking a much needed break as the year closes out. In the midst of the holidays, scheduling guests and maintaining a regular cadence of episodes is quite the challenge. Make no mistake, the work to put together great episodes doesn't stop, but this break just logically makes the most sense for us. Also, as I alluded to in the opening line of the podcast, yours truly is in the midst of a transition. More specifically, I have been chosen as Northwest River Partners' first Deputy Executive Director. So, as of the time of recording, I still need to manage all things communications, but I've also got some new duties on my plate as well, and I'll probably need this break to ensure a smooth transition so that we can strategize and plan for the year ahead. Don't worry though, because regardless of all these changes taking place, your favorite podcast for hydropower rolls on. This break is also a great time for you listeners to catch up on any episodes you missed. And today's episode is in a similar spirit, because we're going to highlight some of your favorite moments from 2024. This special year in review episode is a great chance to get reacquainted with a few guests and stories, or perhaps hear them for the first time and reflect on all the knowledge that has been shared with us. So, without further ado, I'll wrap this intro up, and we can all sit back and enjoy, starting with our most listened to release of 2024, episode 29, Can Hydro Survive Climate Change?, with BPA's Eric Pitlack. In the context of the climate change discussion particularly, so we're looking at something 5 days in advance, 14 days in advance, things like that. But we know, as you're mentioning just now, you can look to maybe next year and say, I think we're going to have an above average winter. When you are looking at, an El Nino winter, or, we're going to have a really warm, dry summer come 2025, things like that, do the extreme weather events show up at all? Or, is there like a probability of, we're probably going to have at least one cold snap or one heat wave during that time period? Or are those things that really only show up on those shorter term models?
That's a mixed answer there, and it depends on what we're talking about in terms of, is it temperature, precipitation, snowpack, stream flow. For example, even though the forecasts turn out to be very accurate that we're going to have a warm winter in the Columbia Basin, it never eliminates the possibility that you're going to have a quick, sharp, cold period like we had. Conversely, same thing can happen where you can have a cold, rotten winter, but you get that 1 week in March that gives everyone hope, and then it gets cold again. So just because you're going to have a whole season that's going to be above or below normal doesn't mean that it will necessarily eliminate the possibility of a more extreme event. However, if we are in a very strong El Nino situation we have this year, that is an atmospheric river situation for California, where a series of them can hit them in rapid succession and cause a lot of flooding and heavy snow. It's great for water supplies, but not great if you're dealing with flooding. in an El Nino, if you know that you've got, okay, here comes one, wait a minute, there might be more coming because, the whole Pacific Ocean, the tropical Pacific is warmer than normal. Okay, we got to watch out for these. And now okay, so if I start seeing one, there's going to probably be more. Same thing with a La Nina, by the way. If we get into a La Nina, and that increases the risk of a below average temperature here in the Columbia Basin. Now we're watching the Arctic very closely because we know that chance of getting an Arctic air mass and a cold snap here, despite climate change, by the way, increases when you're in a La Nina. So it can work in multiple ways. But the other thing that's really important to point out is just because you have one heat wave does not mean that's climate change. But if you start seeing more and more of them, hotter and hotter ones, more frequent ones, that is. And that's one of the things that we look for in the region and that we're already starting to see. Other parts of the country, longer dry spells, particularly the Southwest U.S. One dry spell is not climate change. One drought year is not climate change. But if you start seeing them in succession and you start seeing that, well, wait a minute here, these are coming with the increasing temperatures as well, we got to start taking a look at that more closely. Then it probably is climate change. So that's one of the other things we're a little bit cautious about, is attributing one event to climate change. That attribution science is getting better, but not one event is not caused, quote unquote, by climate change. But you get lots of them, then you got to really start really beginning to wonder at the very least, but possibly really dig in to see if this trend's going to continue.
Yeah, I really appreciate that distinction. And, the question now is like, okay, so we had this event in January, and we know that not only did it deliver snow, ice, cold temperatures, all that, it also put a lot of strain on our energy demand. And in turn, we used a lot of hydropower to step up and meet that demand. When something like that does take place, how much is that disrupting the outlook for the rest of the year and for the season as it relates to particularly the stream flow component? And not so much in our maybe run-of-the-river dams, but in those dams where we're having to potentially tap into some of our reservoirs and use up what's there. You're looking ahead and seeing, how much of that's going to get replenished later on in the season. I mean, is that like a big disruption, or is that kind of a blip on the radar?
It depends. That's a really good it depends question. And that's one of those where that's why there are really, really smart planners at Bonneville Power Administration, that they're the ones that are the ones that figure out, okay, this is going to impact us. We're going to have to ramp up. All right. What's the impact now later on this spring and summer in terms of our fuel supply? I defer to them on that stuff because they're the experts. But in terms of the weather and the stream flows, a cold snap like that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be hurt for the rest of the winter, or a dry couple of weeks doesn't mean we're going to have a low water year. What we're looking for is the cumulative effect of that over the whole season. The other thing too about again, the Columbia River Basin is unique. I wouldn't say unique, but it is a marvel of the Columbia system, is that it's a large geographic area with a lot of geographic diversity. So just because we've got an impact in one area doesn't mean the rest of the system is affected. And that's one of the reasons why hydropower has been so reliable and probably will continue to be even with climate change. Because even if the Snake River Basin, that does look like, the whole basin looks like it's going to get warmer. But as precipitation in the region increases, particularly in Canada and up in the northern parts of the basin, that can insulate us quite a bit. And then conversely, let's say we're having a dry winter in Canada, but the Snake River Basin's okay. That can also balance things out. So because we've got a large geographic diversity, that gives us a lot of insulation from shocks when we get a cold snap or a heat wave.
That certainly makes sense to me, and I'm thinking about some of those rivers maybe on the East Coast and things like that, where they don't necessarily have Cascades or Olympics or Rockies or, all of the different mountain ranges we have here, where I think I assume that's where a lot of our snow is kind of being stored.
It is. It's being stored in our very beautiful mountains.
Yeah.
Where in the eastern U.S., the southeast U.S., you have virtually no snowpack ever, except from an occasional storm. The northeast U.S., the snowpack does have an impact, but it tends to be smaller than it is farther north in Atlantic Canada or southeast Canada, Quebec, Ontario. They also rely very much on snowpack for their water supplies. But our mountains are a valuable resource, and they are our biggest reservoir. Really, that snowpack is our biggest reservoir, and that can hold that water back for several months. If it melts nice and slowly, we have that water for several months into the summer. And again, it's not just for hydropower. I mean, it's beneficial for fish. It's beneficial for navigation. Beneficial for the irrigation that we need for our crops in the region. So that reservoir is very important, and that's probably one of the biggest risks we have with climate change, is that snowpack becoming less and less reliable, particularly in the southern half of the basin, where more precipitation going forward with climate change is going to fall as rain instead of snow. Or it'll rain, snow, and that doesn't give you a reliable snowpack. And we see that in the Cascades already, where you'll get a couple weeks of rain and it just melts a lot of snow off. We get flooding, and then the snowpack starts building again, but then it rains again, and then you keep going back and forth, and that makes it harder and harder to forecast stream flows, because now you don't have that reliable, that snowpack's going to be there for a few months and then it'll come off, hopefully gradually. That's one of our biggest concerns with climate change, is that snowpack becoming less and less reliable for us, not just for prediction, but just for the river flows themselves.
One of the big things that has sparked us having this conversation today was the topic of climate change and the threat it poses to our energy supply. A lot of that relating to this snowpack discussion and the challenges that climate change presents when it comes to having a reliable, predictable snowpack, and one that can power us through the summer by melting off gradually and slowly, as opposed to what you're describing, this sort of quick, rapid runoff that takes place. Many people are concerned by what they're seeing, I think particularly in the desert Southwest. And as I was preparing for this podcast this week, AI must have been listening to me on my phone, because I saw probably 5 or more articles come up in my news feed that were published just this week as we're recording, that all basically said drought and climate change are heralding the end of hydropower in the West. And this is being brought up so often that people are really, whether or not they actually should be, they're feeling very concerned because of what they're seeing. The question is, are those concerns valid? Should we be concerned about what drought means for our hydropower here, particularly in the Northwest?
So, as you've probably gathered, meteorology and hydrology are pretty complex. So is climate. And it's very easy to take something that's going on in one part of the country and lump it over a much larger area. And the climate change is a classic example of that, because the West tends to get all lumped together in one monolithic thing, and we're not. We have very different climates between the Southwest U.S. and the Northwest U.S. And so the responses to climate change in terms of how the atmosphere is going to behave, how the soils are going to behave, how the river is going to behave, how the snowpack is going to behave, is also going to be different. Should we be concerned? And I think the answer is yes, but it's for a different reason. And the Southwest U.S. is really dealing with a long-term drought that's been going on for 20 years now, made worse by climate change. And that's not easy to deal with. And even if the climate gets wetter down there with climate change, evaporation's increasing with temperature as well. And there's a real question, scientific question, on whether the evaporation is going to increase more than the stream flows as the climate gets a little wetter and you start getting more heavier storm system, heavier rains from individual storm systems. In the Pacific Northwest, we have a different problem where we actually think, or it looks like, that precipitation is going to increase in the region because we already get atmospheric rivers, those ribbons of moisture that give us the majority of our rain in Portland and makes some days pretty miserable around here, and quite memorable because it can rain really, really hard with some of those. Those with climate change are likely to carry more moisture because oceans are warming up. They're releasing more moisture into the atmosphere. That feeds into atmospheric rivers. That should increase our precipitation on a winter basis. But if that's falling as rain or snow rather than snow, that becomes a problem in terms of the hydrograph and where the stream flows are occurring, where instead of seeing not a lot of water in the rivers in the winter, it's likely we're going to see more. Now, for hydropower, that might be good in the sense that will give us more generation, and with temperatures not warming over time, you still get winters like you did here this past January, but for the most part, those cold snaps become less and less frequent. Okay, so that may help mitigate one problem that we already have in the basin, which is we can have some really big winter peaks. But then you melt that off early, run it off early, and now your period of low summer flows when it's already dry in the Columbia Basin. July, August, that's why people love it here in July and August, because we don't rain. It's beautiful. But if you extend that period to, you basically run off all your snow in April and May instead of June, now that period of low summer flows we used to have in just August and September now becomes a July, August, September issue. You're lengthening that period of low summer flows as temperatures are warming and as energy demand, especially from air conditioning, is increasing. So we have a different problem, and that we need to definitely address and be concerned about. And that's why discussions about resource adequacy are going on, and making the whole grid more climate resilient, because our problems are different than the Southwest U.S., but they are no less serious in that we have to prepare for them.
Listening back on this moment from our discussion, it's pretty easy to see why this episode was such a hit. Eric had some really thoughtful insights and captivated us all with his perspective. He also just happened to set the stage perfectly for many of the discussions that would follow in 2024, including another that centered on accurate predictions for addressing and planning for energy challenges. The Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee, or PNUC, released their 2024 Northwest Regional Forecast and caught the attention of many, as they highlighted accelerating load growth over the next decade that will need to be met with additional resources. Luckily for us, PNUC's executive director, Crystal Ball, joined us on episode 32 of DAM to help dissect what this really all means. Here's that snippet from Forecasting Our Clean Energy Future. What were the biggest takeaways from the 2024 forecast?
The Northwest Regional Forecast of Loads and Resources takes a look at the next 10 years. So it's a forecast of loads and resources for the next 10 years. So the biggest change that we saw was on the demand side, on load. And we saw a continued momentum for the projected surge in demand for electricity. It's really quite remarkable when we compare it to past years. This year's forecast projects that demand could increase by over 30% in the next 10 years, that it could increase by more than 7,000 average megawatts. As we talked, that's a lot. It is equivalent to meeting the needs of 7 cities the size of Seattle. So the load forecast of just the surge in demand for electricity is certainly the first big takeaway. The second takeaway is on the resources side. And so utilities think about their load, and then they think about how they are going to serve that load and what resources they are going to use. What we see is an unprecedented amount of planned future resources. 29,000 megawatts nameplate capacity show up in this year's 10-year outlook of resources. That is an unprecedented amount of generation to build in the next 10 years. So again, we see really two big takeaways from our Northwest forecast of loads and resources. The load surge in demand for electricity could grow over 30% in 10 years. And then on the resources side, just an unprecedented amount of new generation in the future.
So that one seems fairly straightforward in terms of describing, what's going on there to our audience. But that first piece, the amount of growth we're anticipating, which you described very nicely as being essentially 7 Seattle's worth of energy. We're not looking at 7 times the size of Seattle being built in the Northwest in terms of population growth. I mean, there's certainly growth taking place, but nothing on that sort of magnitude. What would you say has changed as far as the outlook from previous forecasts to 2024 that's showing such an increase in demand coming online?
Yeah, that's a great question. And another reason why we do the forecast. We are saying that this surge in demand for electricity is attributed to a few things. Data center development, high-tech manufacturing growth, and then that trend towards electrification. That's very different than what we have had in our region in the past. In fact, in 2022, when I worked with Shauna on my first regional forecast, we weren't really seeing much of a change in the demand for electricity. And then in 2023, when my colleague Eliza Seelig and I worked on this together, we were seeing a really big change. And it was because utilities were becoming more certain about really big new loads with the data center development. And that's not happening just in our region. If you think of Virginia and Texas, their demand for electricity from the data center development dwarfs what we are experiencing here in the Northwest. So the companies developing the data centers really see some advantages for developing those data centers here in our region. And they are getting bigger than they have been before because of the need. And we're seeing an incredible need coming from the growth of artificial intelligence.
Well, that is something, too, that I would definitely sort of amplify and maybe build on top of is I think back to an example of probably about 10 years ago now, going to visit a friend who lived in Bend, Oregon at the time. Mm-hmm. And the big talk of the town was that the Facebook server was coming in. And so all the construction was going on. There were all these people who were hired to build it and maintain it and do all these different things. And that was all, there's been to some degree something that you could describe under the umbrella of AI, but just in the last few years alone, it's completely exploded.
Yes.
And so the nature of what these data centers do and what they are is very different from what it has been.
Yes.
And I think, neither of us are data center experts. We're not AI experts. We're coming at this from an energy perspective. But I think it's worth pointing out that as far as the landscape of what these data centers not only do, but also what they need is so incredibly different. And, as we're seeing, it's a rapid change, right? I mean, as fast as I can ask my phone to do certain things, or, this new one that I've gotten now, I can completely remove people from photos using AI.
Oh,
or
wow.
I can
Yeah.
actually, another very interesting feature is, if I took a picture and it was crooked and I wanted to straighten it,
Yeah.
I can tilt it back to straight, and instead of having to crop parts of the image to accomplish that, it will just fill in the missing pieces with AI. And it's so good at doing it that you can't even, I've experimented with it, right? It's like you can't even tell.
Yeah.
But something that you and I discussed this morning, actually, before we even recorded, was every time that I do that, or anyone listening does that, we are having an impact on our energy demand.
Yes.
And on the amount of load that is being applied to the grid through these data centers.
Right. It's a surge in demand for electricity that we just haven't seen. And you started with the data center in Central Oregon for Facebook, and that's cloud storage.
Mm-hmm.
And the data centers that we are seeing being developed now are for different reasons, and it is something that we use in our everyday life. When you think about it, we have our phones, and we ask we ask this computer in our pocket to do so many things, but it's also like how our economy runs too, and it's the security of our financial system, and so there's so much more, and I am curious about this development and the electricity need to really accommodate these developments. I've heard it described this year as an insatiable demand for electricity. And so I have a lot more to learn. I'm very curious about what it takes, but it's certainly driving a surge in demand for electricity that those of us working in this industry right now may have never have seen before. If you go back to the 70s, there was projections in an incredible demand for electricity, and we did different things back then. This is different. This is an industry that's going to need a lot of electricity to keep it powering, and it's going to really impact our economy. So we need to keep up with it. We need to be curious about it. And I know that utilities who are working with the companies developing these data centers are learning as fast as they can, and certainly building as fast as they can. There's a lot more coordination too around that with these really big buyers of electricity coordinating more with utilities. So there's a whole lot more to do, but it is the number one big change, I think, in our industry. But then on the resources side,
Right.
yes, we have a changing resource mix.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
I would also, to just quickly say, and I know that it's something that we're probably way in advance of ever getting to this point, but it does start to feel like maybe the conversation that we're already having with energy efficiency right now could potentially shift in terms of, in the past, maybe we tell people to turn the lights off when they leave the house, or we ask them to upgrade certain appliances or household items that can be more efficient. And now we might be asking them, hey, don't ask AI to do everything. Maybe try writing that assignment without.
I don't know. It's gonna make our life more. I wish I could predict the future.
Right.
But it's really gonna be transformational, and I think that this technology has the potential to make things a lot better, and to we can use this technology in our industry to collect a lot more data, and we can process that data so much faster, right? And that can make us more efficient as an industry. There's so much to learn about this technology and what it can do to make our lives better.
When it comes to some of the other differences and trends from, say, 2 years ago to now, what are we looking at just as far as, we have these big overarching discussions about the load growth and about the sort of, circumstances of meeting these clean energy mandates and bringing new resources online, taking others off. But there's other things certainly that I'm sure are factoring into this as well that are creating this sort of different picture right now than what we've seen in years past.
Yes. I mentioned the trend in electrification. And so what I mean by that is transitioning to electricity for transportation. So the increasing demand from electric vehicles. And also as we think about generating electricity with cleaner resources, and then also meeting our energy needs with cleaner resources, that could transition load from heating your home with natural gas to heating your home with electricity now. So that's driving an increase in demand for electricity.
And then in terms of the outlook for building this new generation to meet that demand, where are we at as a region? I mean, we've talked about already that these things don't happen overnight. So when it comes to predicting how much we can build, how much we need to build, and when we expect it to actually be available, where are we at right now?
There is a great transformation happening in the electric utility industry, and we are seeing an increase in generation coming from wind and solar. And you can drive around this region and you can see more solar and you can see more wind power, and so that is a big transformation happening. These resources are getting built. There are challenges in building these resources. It's one thing to develop these resources in areas where there's wind and sunshine. It's another thing to build the energy infrastructure to get the power from where it's produced to where it is consumed. When we looked at the data, we really wanted to emphasize this need for upgrading the region's electricity infrastructure. That includes the generation and the transmission infrastructure, those high voltage lines that get the power from where it's produced to where it's needed. So again, building the generation is one thing, getting that generation to where it's consumed is a whole other thing.
And there's also that conversation around the intermittency of those resources of wind and solar not being able to produce energy on demand, on notice when we need it.
That's right.
Which obviously brings up the storage question as well of where do we store that energy so that we can then access it when it's actually needed, not just when it's being generated.
That's right. And if you think about the advancements in storage, in energy storage, it makes me think of what's going on in California on their battery storage, because they have a lot of new renewable resources, especially solar, and the storage capability in California has grown exponentially in just a few short years. Here in the Northwest, we're different because we have these peak needs that are prolonged, that happen in winter when there isn't a whole lot of solar around. The hydropower system is a dependable resource that has the ability to store a lot of water that can be used to produce power behind those large reservoirs. It's also a very flexible resource, and has allowed this region to integrate a lot of those intermittent resources, because we've been able to store water when those intermittent resources are available. And then when they're not, we can release water from the hydropower system. So it's been a very symbiotic kind of relationship. But as utilities develop more wind and solar, we are seeing utilities add battery storage and other energy storage resources to the resource mix.
While on the surface, the 10% load growth over the next decade, which amounts to 7,400 megawatts, was indeed daunting to many. But it was nice to hear a more reassuring and positive take from Crystal. She also provided a very easy to understand breakdown of what they're seeing, what we might reasonably expect, and how it's really not all doom and gloom as it might sound. Predictions and models are one thing, but what about the real world? Well, way back on episode 25, we had the pleasure of hosting Clearwater Power's Bob Pierce, who's made a bit of a name for himself answering the local community's burning questions in a blog of sorts titled Ask Bob. And rightfully so, we also titled the episode Ask Bob. Now, one question that Clearwater's customers had was whether or not the generation from the lower Snake River dams could be replaced with solar generation. And fittingly, we wanted to get his take here on dam as well. After listening to the previous two highlights, I think you'll find his answer and real world examples all the more interesting.
As far as whether or not we can replace the power from the 4 lower Snake River dams with solar, what is your take on that?
Well, I mean, the short answer is no. And I guess, yeah, it's a little bit longer story to explain why. But theoretically, if you had enough land and you spent enough money on solar panels, you could generate the same amount of kilowatt hour energy that the dams put out. But that's not the full story. In fact, that's not even the important piece. What's important is the ability to meet load at the exact moment when it's needed on the grid. And solar generates really good at noon in July, when you have a ton of sun and it's coming straight down on the solar panel. But in January, it's only generating about 20% of that amount, even on a sunny day. And if it's a cloudy or foggy day, that can drop to 0. And in an ice storm, the panels can get covered in ice and snow and drop to 0 generation. So the trouble is that at Clearwater Power, our load is 3 times higher in the wintertime than it is in the summertime, because most of our load is electric heat from residential accounts. And so solar generating all of its electricity in July is not a good fit for our load that occurs mostly in January and February, And I'll give you a specific example. A month ago, we experienced a bitter cold snap. I think most of the Northwest did. And some of our customers were experiencing low temperatures of 20 below 0. The solar panels at our office were covered in 2 inches of ice and not generating anything at all. But the lower Snake River dams were generating 24/7 to meet the load. In fact, according to BPA's numbers on their website, they were providing over 10% of the total BPA system capacity during those peak load times. And solar and wind on BPA's system were at 0 or near 0 during those same times. So if we had followed the Biden administration's plan and breached the lower Snake River dams and replaced them with solar power, we would have been at a very serious risk of rolling blackouts during that cold snap. And that's just not something that you can have. I mean, people would have died, when it's that cold. So another big difference that people don't know about hydropower is that it's dispatchable. One of the ways they utilize those dams is called spinning reserve. And for example, Lower Granite Dam has 6 turbines. They can take one of those turbines and have it spinning with water moving through the turbine. So it's up to full speed, but not connected to the grid electrically. And that way, when more power is needed, they can just flip a switch and immediately add about 135 megawatts to the capacity of the grid. But you can't do that with solar. You can't tell the sun to shine on a solar panel or tell the wind to blow on a wind turbine. So that's why hydropower is called firm power or dispatchable power when wind and solar is not.
Yeah, as someone who's been focused deeply on the subject for a long time, it all totally makes perfect sense to me. But I appreciate that explanation because, we are trying to reach an audience with this podcast who uh, isn't isn't necessarily an expert and doesn't necessarily have the expectation or the burden of being an expert by default. So it's really good to kind of clear up that story and really get that information out there. Um, I just over this last weekend before our recording today saw that USA Today had released an article showing that renewable energy projects are oftentimes being rejected or even outright banned by, say, city or county or state governments faster than they're being built right now. Wind and solar, obviously, being kind of the large land users is one such reason for that. How much do you feel that something like that could factor into replacing hydro with solar as well?
Yeah, I read that article as well, and it is a big issue. Many people don't want to look at large scale wind or solar projects that are visible from miles away sometimes. And if they have adjoining property, they definitely have big concerns about how it'll affect their property values. And so it gets into things like setbacks, how far does a wind turbine have to be set back from the property line, that kind of thing. Um, and it does make it difficult to cite those projects, but sometimes rightly so, in my mind, because it's not really fair for the adjoining property owners to have their property values decimated, especially if that generation is not even going to be a good fit for the region. You know, like in Southern California, Arizona, and Nevada, solar can work a lot better because that generation at noon in July coordinates well with their air conditioning load. That's when they have their peak needs. At the same time, the solar's getting its peak generation. So it's a good fit generation profile to load profile. But like I was talking about earlier, it's more opposite to our load profile. So it's not a good fit. And I don't think it makes sense to condemn people's property values in that for that. But even if you can get approved to site, say, a 500-acre solar farm, one of the big issues that they didn't talk about in this article is you have to connect that to the grid somehow. And that can be a much bigger issue than building the solar farm itself. You need access to a substation and a transmission line that has capacity to move that power to where it's going to be used. And that typically means building new transmission lines and usually a new substation as well, which means getting easements and purchasing property, getting easements from every property owner between the solar farm and where it needs to go. And that can cause delays that decades to try to get easements for every single, it only takes one property owner to block the entire project. So that can be another siting issue that a lot of times people don't understand that are outside the industry.
I have definitely heard those stories from some of our other members, and the time that it takes to get even a small section of transmission line built, it can be enormously challenging.
I guess the only other thing I'd say about that USA Today article is it talks about adding solar and wind to meet the federal clean energy guidelines by 2035. But it doesn't really talk about the fact that both hydropower and nuclear power also meet those same guidelines because they're 100% carbon free. And, sometimes I wish people would focus more on maintaining the hydropower we have and possibly looking at expanding our nuclear power.
It definitely is. It's a strange thing that comes up quite a bit. Is the questions around hydropower and whether it's considered a renewable resource. Maybe not in the eyes of the public or even by definition, but as it relates to those regulatory policies. it's definitely a big challenge that I think the industry has been trying to tackle.
Yeah, exactly.
Another thing too that I think maybe would be good to clear up on this subject while we're here is a lot of times, people, I think they see things like rooftop solar, for example, and maybe in their minds that is what they're thinking of in terms of, replacing something like the lower Snake River dams with solar. But as far as, what we're talking about with a solar farm taking up a large amount of acreage to build out something like this, I mean, am I wrong in saying that rooftop solar alone would not be a realistic or, possible way for replacing those dams?
No, you're not wrong at all. I haven't run the numbers for exactly how many acres, but you're talking about thousands of acres of solar panels, possibly even into the tens of thousands. It would just be a phenomenal amount of area that would be required to generate that kind of power. Because you're talking about, the nameplate on the lower Snake dams is over 3,000 megawatts. That's 3,000 million watts. That's just a tremendous amount of energy.
When Bob spoke to the threat of extreme cold temperatures and the risks of losing power, it struck a chord with many and rightfully earned its place on this episode. One thing that these guests and episodes all had in common as well is that they put a spotlight on the need for access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy, and demonstrated the value of hydropower in being able to help the Northwest meet those needs. We didn't want the message to stop there, though, and in 2024, we were introduced to Chris Sidmore, who heads up the Flathead Food Bank in northwest Montana. Chris has been nothing short of incredible to work with, and his dedication to serving those in need is evident. We were also lucky enough to feature his story as part of our Cost Cap special. And that story, which illustrates just how critical, reliable, and affordable energy is to everyday people, is the perfect one to end with here today. Enjoy this highlight from episode 37.
I have the privilege of being the executive director here. Great staff, wonderful volunteers, and we get to serve an absolutely amazing portion of our population here in the Flathead Valley. So, as many people might know, if they're from the area, we've seen kind of the typical housing prices have gone up. We've seen an inflation in food. A lot of our clients are just kind of getting squeezed from all different directions. On a yearly basis, we see over about 6,000 individuals who come into our pantry. We also work with a lot of kids as well. We're in 19 different schools. We serve about 14,000 what we call backpacks. So food that goes out to kids that might not have food on the weekend. And kind of our typical client would be, well, I don't know if there's a typical one, but it's people that are just above, that poverty level, and then a life event happens. So there's, a death in the family, somebody gets sick, somebody gets hurt. A life event, it dips them into poverty, and they end up here at the food bank.
So, in terms of the sensitivity that those kind of folks have to rising costs, I mean, maybe you could speak to that a little bit more. How much, as you mentioned, it takes maybe just one tragedy to put somebody in that position. I imagine, it doesn't take much in terms of a rising bill or something like that to make things even that much tougher. And obviously, energy costs are a big part of that, right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think most people kind of gravitate towards those shock and awe answers where, sometimes it is a car crash or sometimes it's, a sickness, but a lot of times, just kind of like you talked about, it's food costs have gone up, or in this case, if energy costs go up, really, if anything goes up, it affects our customers. A couple different statistics that I've been thinking about lately. We just did a big survey of a lot of our clients, and over 11% of our clients responded that in the last 12 months, they had to cut the size or forego giving one of their children a meal because of the situation they were in. So again, you think about how, beautiful but desperate our clients are. Only 13% of them responded that they were able to eat a balanced meal on a daily basis. And actually, one of our questions that we had was, what happened that made it necessary for you to utilize a Flathead food bank? Over 32% of our clients responded that there had been an increase in the cost of gas, fuel, or other energy, uh, methods that they use. So, the margins are razor thin. So if anything goes up, even a small percentage, that can put someone over the edge.
And when we're talking something that could be 10, 15, 25, who knows in terms of those kind of percentages, those are a big deal.
Oh, they really are. And I always try to tell people, just imagine, another statistic that jumped out to me is, out of the clients that we surveyed, 21% of them said that they were foregoing prescription pills that they needed. 42% said that they weren't able to get the medical need because they couldn't afford it, and 63% couldn't afford dental care. So in a real practical sense, I mean, there's only so many dollars left at the end of the day for our clients. And if they're down to the point where they're saying, do we feed our children? Do I get that prescription I need? And then all of a sudden, if they get their energy bill or they go to the gas pump and that's increased an extra $20, $30. I mean, it's not even fun for myself, but again, the margins are so thin for these people that an increase in electrical costs could very well mean, they have to skip another prescription, or now they're definitely not going to see the doctor.
And that's certainly something that I don't think anyone is in favor of. I mean, it's not a choice that we want people to have to make at the end of the day.
Oh, exactly. Yep. And that's kind of the way I look at it. We always kind of look at almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where, hopefully we can get people prescription drugs, food, energy, you name it. But, when these prices of energy and other things start to go up, that's normally, something has to be cut, and it's normally not something we want our people to go without.
We've also talked a lot on this podcast, and even on this episode of this podcast with some of the other guests we've interviewed, that in addition to costs and the concerns that we have about, raising energy prices, we're also equally concerned about making sure that we can buffer ourselves against extreme weather events and the impacts of climate change. And it's something that we talk a lot about in terms of, a hydropower or like a energy reliability perspective. But just in terms of overall impacts, I'd be really curious to hear how an extreme weather event, particularly miserable cold snap or a really hot dry spell, can put further pressure on the folks that you're serving.
Yeah, definitely. Good question. And I mean, if you're from the Northwest, you probably get it. If you're listening to this podcast and you're somewhere else, I mean, lightning storms all the time, heat waves like you're talking about with -30 or something last January is just miserable. And without that option to get us back up and going back on the grid, it causes all sorts of problems. We're really reliant on our coolers and freezer systems, and those are all ran off of electricity. So again, we're serving close to 10,000 individuals a year. People, a huge percentage of our population that's relying on us. So if our freezers go down for a long time, we've got tens of thousands of dollars worth of food that could potentially go bad. We also work really closely with a lot of other nonprofits where they provide shelter, for example. So again, without electric heat, they're in a world of hurt. And then a lot of our clients that come in, they don't even have ways to cook their food without electricity. So it's just at an organizational level, valley-wide in a lot of ways. And again, just very basic stuff, preserving food, giving our clients a way to cook, to stay warm. So it's it's pretty devastating when we lose power for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, they're basic needs that I think obviously so many of us can take for granted. But when you're actually in a position where those basic needs aren't
as guaranteed or secure, I'm sure it it's definitely a really uncomfortable position to be in, and something that we don't want anybody to have to go through.
Well, and that's just it, and it's okay for me as a homeowner. I mean, it's not great, but especially here at the food bank, I mean, when there's a day when we're without power, luckily our local branch, Flathead Electric, they're always good at getting us right back online. But I mean, just being blunt, if we were without power for uh, an extended period of time, we'd be in trouble. It'd be a huge cost to us, and we wouldn't be able to serve our already vulnerable population.
Thanks as always for sticking around to the end here today. As I said, 2024 was a special year for DAM, and none of this would be possible without the support of our hydro-loving audience. We could only highlight a select number of stories and episodes on this year in review, but to everyone who joined us over the course of the 23 podcasts we released this year, shared their insights and wisdom, and gave us their slice of life advice, thank you. I'm uniquely privileged as the host of this podcast to make great conversations a part of my work, and I myself learned so much from sitting back and listening to what our guests have to share. To share that with all of you truly puts a smile on my face. So, please continue to engage with us. Whether that's contacting us through nwriverpartners.org, signing up for our newsletter, giving this podcast a positive review on your favorite listening platform, and subscribing so you don't miss future episodes, sharing the show with family and friends, or catching up with us on social media. Everything that you do to support this work goes a long way, and we're incredibly grateful that you're here. Now, it's been a good year for DAM, and it's been a damn good year. But there's no doubt, come January of 2025, we're going to keep that momentum rolling. In the meantime, I hope you'll all have a wonderful holiday season. Get to spend quality time with the people who matter most to you and are filled with joy and gratitude. And hey, don't worry, those big old turbines will keep on turning to keep you warm, cook up your favorite foods, and light up all of those Christmas lights. Yes, even the Griswolds. So, until next year, see ya.